So what I'm going to talk about today is basically three things. There are three things I want you to know. Well, first off, I want to tell you that everything that I talk about here in terms of diabetes is type 2 diabetes, so that we're clear on that. There are three things, and this is my opinion and not necessarily popular opinion, but I think if you go into the anthropological research, I think you'll see that more and more people are coming on board with this, and that is that humans are carnivores. We thought we were omnivores, but we were mistaken. We were basing that on our teeth, but we never took a look at the gut in that much detail. Also, eating for dental health enhances physical and mental health. Who knew? So basically, if you eat such that you don't cause tooth decay and gum disease, your health will improve. And also, low carb, high fat is the bomb for dental and mental health. All right, and especially for those of us like me who are diabetic, pre-diabetic, and need to be on a lower carbohydrate diet. It's a very healing diet for many of us. Okay? So my background, basically I started out as a dog trainer, and the thing that I noticed in the room full of dogs is that the dogs that were ready to learn were the ones who were calm, clear-eyed, had beautiful wet noses, wet pads. They looked in the peak of health. And in the longer furred dogs, if you ran your hand along the fur, it would ripple back, almost like a mink coat. It was just gorgeous. The dogs that were not ready to learn were shaky, nervous, more inclined to be fear biters. They had dandruff, they had dry noses, and they had dry pads. And the thing I noticed about the diets that the dogs that were healthy were eating was that it was very high in fat. So if you reached into the bag of kibble, you would come out with a greasy hand. We should take a lesson from this. Our dogs and cats are now obese. Our dogs and cats now have gum disease. They also are losing their teeth at earlier and earlier ages. They have arthritis. They have many of the chronic modern diseases that we have. Okay, so what happened to us? In February of 1977, the first dietary goals for the United States came out. I'm sure this is old news for you. It said increase carbohydrates and decrease dietary fat, and especially saturated fat. And as you can see, Americans complied. We did exactly what we were supposed to do. Up with the carbohydrates, down with the fat, and down with protein as well. And the quality of protein also declined as we started depending more on plants. Well, this is what happened. You can see almost to the date. And by the way, these are government graphs. These are not graphs that I made up. These are government graphs. And you can see almost to the date exactly when those guidelines came out and exactly when obesity began. And we started at a very high curve, not only in adults, but also in children and adolescents. And there's a lag time, however, and I'm not going to go through these maps, but basically there's a lag time between obesity and diabetes, but there is a connection. So now 1 in 3 children in the United States is either overweight or obese. About 1 in 4 adults, remember this, 1 in 4 adults has non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. 1 in 4. So if you project down the decades, you can see that we're going to be making some very hard decisions about liver transplants. 1 in 10 children also has non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And this is the kind of liver disease that we used to only see in alcoholics. So basically, this was a bonanza for the food companies. It was perpetuated. You can see that the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics premier sponsors are Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola. Big money flows through all of this. And I think even once we get the science right, it's going to be a while before things change. Health in the United States now. This is some bad news. Number 1 in the world for percentage of obese persons. Number 1 in total health expenditures per capita, and yet we don't seem to get our money's worth in America. Number 22 among industrialized nations for healthy life expectancy. So to psychiatrists, the circumpolar region is very interesting because we noticed that these were people who endured 24 hours of night, and yet they didn't seem to have seasonal affective disorder, which is a type of depression that comes in winter. And they all seemed to be pretty cheerful up there in the far north. And we thought they were just particularly hardy people. Until 4 years later, in 2004, a cry came up. The prevalence of disability due to mental and behavioral disorders in Iceland has been rising. So what happened? Here's the explanation later on. The change in traditional diets has already led to increased health problems such as obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, while the mental health of circumpolar peoples has also declined substantially during the same time period. These things are linked. These things are linked. We should always keep this in mind. Diabetes, heart disease, mental illness, linked. So, dietary strategies. Here's where we get into the weeds. What exactly are we? Should we eat like the omnivore chimpanzee, who eats approximately 5 to 10% of its diet in small mammals, lizards, eggs, birds? Or should we go vegetarian? In this case, vegan. Veganish, because he does get some insects on his leaves. But that's not what he's going for. He's basically digesting cellulose. Anybody here can digest cellulose? Good at it? All right. So there were some researchers who took a look at the internal workings of the great apes and compared them to human beings. And I want to tell you that that crosshatch design that you see is basically human. And we're going to take a look at the inner workings. All right. So basically, when you take a look at this, what you see is that the relative gut volume, that's the percentage of the gut that a certain organ takes up, is relatively the same across the board for the siamang, the orangutan, the great apes, including the chimpanzee, the gorilla, and the human being. But take a look just to the right, and you see something astounding. Do you see that small intestine? Small intestine for the human being is greater than double for most of the apes. All right, and this is the small intestine is where things like meat just disappear. Okay, the vegetation has to go further down into fermentation, and I'll tell you more about fermentation. You're going to hear that word a lot in this lecture, fermentation. Okay, so the vegetables are going to go down into fermentation. So in order to be able to ferment vegetables adequately, we have to have a good fermentation system. And what you see on the far right here, do you see the colon? The colon is the area of fermentation. And do you see that tiny little bar for human beings? All right. Well, that's how it looks from a gross anatomy perspective. So let's look at function. Let's see if this actually proves out in function. All right, so now if you're going to ferment things, then you have to have good fermentation capacity. And you can see as you look along here that cattle and sheep, we're not surprised that they're good fermenters, right? But keep following this and you'll find the rat and the pig, who are omnivores, have great fermentation capacity. And then you get down to man, cat, and dog. So no wonder our furry friends followed us around the campfires. They loved what we were eating. We threw them the best scraps. And if you look here, this is just the same thing, only in numbers. If people like numbers here, you can see 17, 16, and I think 15. In any case, humans, cats, and dogs are around the same fermentative capacity. And now I challenge you, which two stomachs look almost like twins? The dog and the human. Okay, and you can see there's a rat, and I think there's also a pig, and those don't look very much like our stomachs at all. So Elias Suni, I think they're Swedish. Anyway, and colleagues analyzed 70 species of mammal and basically based it on, first off, diet. And so 20% or more of the diet being animal-based would qualify. And they basically charted out the time to weaning versus brain development. Because in evolution, brain development was a very big thing for human beings. It's what put us out ahead of the rest. What they found, based on their data, is that humans were determined to be carnivores based on diet, weaning, and brain development. And to give you a contrast, the gorilla and chimpanzee wean at about 4 years, and the human much sooner. So that was part of the data that they used. Okay, this is what the data looks like. You don't have to worry too much about it. But you can see that the dots, the human dots, fit very neatly in their carnivore category. All right, so in human evolution, as I mentioned, the large brain was a big deal. It consumes 20% of our energy at rest. So you sitting here are using 20% of all the energy that you're using in your brain. And the human brain having this kind of requirement meant that the human had to go out and get good, solid food with a lot of calories, and that was nutrient dense. Very important. So if a human was to gather acorns, and hopefully, as I'll mention later, he prepared it properly, was to gather acorns, probably score about 1,500 calories per hour of expenditure. However, if the human being hunted a game pig called a collared peccary, for every hour invested, they could score about 65,000 calories. So if you're feeding a village, what are you going to go after? Plus, eating snout to tail, basically the nutrient density there is unparalleled. Humans became bipedal and streamlined. We ended up basically running down game. We would overheat the game. That's what we would do. Sometimes in relays, humans being as bright as they are, but they would run down game. Hair loss and development of sweat was about 3 million years ago. This is why we could outrun them, because they could not, most of our game animals could not sweat. And we were suited to daytime persistence hunting to obtain meat with fat, marrow, and brain. So those were the days, yes? All right. So studies indicate that about 73% of hunter-gatherer tribes studied obtained approximately 55 to 65% of their energy from animal source. And the further north you go, the more of a carnivore diet you have. The more toward the equator, then that's where you start seeing more fruits, vegetables, and other things. But even these things had to be carefully prepared. Okay, so here's our unnatural history of man. And this is just a nice little illustration telling me that I'm about a third through my talk here. So in the news, slash sugar intake to fight obesity and tooth decay from the World Health Organization. They lump those two together, and I'm going to try to draw a cause and effect here. I may not be successful, but who knows what the future will show. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about fermentable carbohydrates. And when I talk about fermentable carbohydrates, that is like two really big words. They're very valuable at breakfast around people you just met because you want them to know that you know a lot of stuff. You say, how are you enjoying your fermentable carbohydrates? Yes. But actually, all I'm talking about is the stuff that dentists say you have to brush away from your teeth. Because these are carbohydrates that basically bacteria make acids from, and then it gets into your teeth, causes tooth decay. So that's all I'm talking about here, is as it applies to the mouth. So I'm using a dental definition. Here are some examples of of fermentable carbohydrates, refined starches. And so it's not just sugar, it's also refined starch. And these things get up against the teeth, they get between the teeth. If you don't brush, if you don't floss, then they can rot your teeth and cause gum disease. It turns out that since 1977, Americans have been increasingly basing their diet on fermentable carbohydrates. And if it wasn't for sealants and all kinds of protective efforts made with children, our children's teeth would rot. And this was a terrible thing in El Salvador recently. Children who used to greet people, visitors, with these beautiful white teeth began greeting visitors with blackened front teeth. And some of these children didn't even make it out into the street because they were in such terrible pain. And what happened was the soda companies and the potato chip companies and the corn chip companies had arrived. And so these children never needed dentistry before, but now they do. But they didn't know about it. Their parents didn't know about it. And now their parents are experiencing obesity and diabetes as well. So we still have some small communities where our food has not reached. But every time our foods, especially our snack foods, get there, they wreak havoc with people's health. So basically, this is a family, and this load of groceries is supposed to represent about a week's worth of food for this family, of typical American food. So I'm going to tell you a tale of two dentists. I want to start with Weston A. Price. I think Weston A. Price deserves a great deal of credit for helping us get where we are now, and the Weston A. Price Foundation as well. They were my first experience with learning that butter was a good thing. So my quality of life went up immediately. I am very grateful. But they also, Weston A. Price basically followed National Geographic back then in the 1920s, when there were many, many societies that had not seen the British foods, the jams, the jellies, the flour, the sugar, and the canned foods. They had not seen this. And so he was able to do a before and after within a generation of photographs and documenting diet. One of the things that he points out is that if you go to North America and Canada and you dig up these Indian skulls, you see these beautiful broad arches. You see 32 teeth grown in. You see that the third molars are very useful. They're not routinely pulled. They don't give them trouble because the arches are so large. And you also see that there's not, among the hunter-gatherer tribes, you see not even a cavity. And one of the things that agriculture brought was cavities. In fact, anthropologists, when they're looking at a dig, they will actually search the skull for cavities, for tooth decay, to see whether this is an agricultural society. Yeah, this is a take-home lesson for all of us. If you're getting cavities, there's a very good chance that you're eating the wrong way. Yes? So he said fat-soluble vitamins were very important for building these big, strong bones. And I think that we should learn that low-fat is not a good way to go. So here are the South Pacific Islanders, and you see on the left the native diet, and you see these beautiful big arches, big white teeth, white smiles. And actually, he also noticed that the character of these people was very optimistic. These were happy people. And then you look on the right and you see the diet of commerce. And not only do you see rotting teeth and crooked teeth, but you also see a thinning and narrowing of the face. And by the way, this is starting to happen in China now. Those square faces that we're so used to seeing are becoming long and narrow. Okay, so even cavemen couldn't get away with eating anything they wanted to. This is a situation where some people living in a cave basically had tooth decay. And what had happened was they had started eating acorns just as they were. They didn't prepare them properly. So they ended up having tooth decay. And that's something that if you have no dentist, you may not be able to survive, especially if it's in the front teeth or up in this triangle area of the face. These kinds of abscesses can kill you. So little has changed since the Paleolithic era. We still have our Stone Age bodies. Let me tell you a tale of the second dentist. Now, this dentist was sitting in the airport eating gummy bears and reading Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes. Yes? When he had an aha watershed moment, he said, it starts here in the mouth and it moves into the body. He said, if we don't pay attention to that tooth decay, which is a 5-alarm fire that you can't ignore, and if we don't change our ways in that moment, then we will have problems. So he wrote this paper in 2009 called Dietary Carbohydrates and Dental Systemic Disease. And by dental systemic disease, he's talking about things that start out dental and end up physical. And now we know mental as well. Mm-hmm. So he says about 60% of mortality worldwide is secondary to chronic non-communicable disease. This would be things like heart disease, diabetes, things that you can't share with someone else. You can't give that to them as far as we know, right? So this affects people for decades or a lifetime and is include, but not limited to, as I mentioned, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, dementia, and certain cancers. I saw this sign in New York. I just about fell over. It says, "Candy discount store for all your needs." This should be shocking to us, and yet it's something that probably most of us would not notice unless we were talking about this sort of thing a lot. Yes. Per the American Heart Association, Americans are very addicted to sugar. Adults, 22 teaspoons a day. Adolescents, 34 teaspoons. And it may have gone up. This was from several years ago. And refined starches, by the way, are not considered in this tally, but I think they should be. Because basically, a bag of bread is a bag of glucose. A bowl of unsweetened cornflakes is a bowl of glucose. And if you pour non-fat milk on that, then you're pouring on lactose. So basically, you're just eating sugar on sugar on sugar, and this is what's being promoted here in the US. Many a child I've had to get off of Fruit Loops and skim milk. Because at some point, around 2009, there was this Smart Check program that was endorsed by a number of dietitians, and the Fruit Loops box had a Smart Check because it was sprinkled with a little bit of fiber. But to my way of thinking, this is a box of ADHD. Here are a bunch of food colors that can cause hyperactivity in children that are not hyperactive. Here's a group of refined carbohydrates that are going to have poor little Johnny in a tailspin right around 10 in the morning in class. He's going to have a terrible time because he's going to go diving down in terms of blood sugar. So I'm going to show that in just a little bit. So this is a problem. During World War II, we had an embargo against the Japanese, or so we thought. And basically what we said is you can't have any more of our refined carbohydrates. You can't have any more of our fermentable carbohydrates. You are cut off. And what happened? Basically, dental decay went down. Diabetes went down, almost in perfect line with the carbohydrates. This is from Hujol's paper, by the way. Hujol said, tooth decay and gum disease are not just local infections. Right. So people can argue all they want and tell you, well, carbohydrates are fine, carbohydrates are good, but I would argue that there are some carbohydrates that really should not cross the threshold of our mouths because they'll be ruinous. They'll cause trouble, all right? So what happens when you ferment a carbohydrate? Well, the bacteria pretty much take care of the sugars in it. That's why it turns out, for example, that whole wheat bread has a very steep sugar rise, steeper than many candy bars. But sourdough does not have the same kind of rise. White bread, by the way, also doesn't have the same kind of rise. I don't even know how to explain that one. All right, some things I cannot explain. But that's for us to find out. It'd be boring if we knew everything already. So fermentable carbohydrates also may lead to bacteria in the blood. And there is some suggestion now that there are pieces of what we call lipopolysaccharide, which is pieces of bacteria lodged in the brains of persons with Alzheimer's. Whether they're innocent bystanders or whether they're setting up that inflammation, I don't know. But it looks like having gum disease is not a good thing. Heart disease, linked to heart disease, diabetes, dementia, rheumatoid arthritis, and also premature birth. Cause and effect, again, this remains to be seen. What we knew in 1912. Now, this is where fermentable carbohydrates come into the realm of obesity. We should have known this. Every farmer knew this. The Encyclopedia of Livestock, which you can find online on page 545, basically says skim milk is one of the most valuable adjuncts of the farm for fattening swine. Skim milk, which is largely lactose. You've taken the fat out of it. The most economical returns, and here they're talking about in terms of fat because that's what was prized. The most economical returns are secured when the milk is fed with cornmeal. Okay, so try to imagine the USDA food pyramid of 1992. And what exactly is it? It's grains and non-fat dairy. Grains and non-fat dairy. Fermentable carbohydrates also influence the microbiome. And again, the microbiome is very, very new science. We know it influences it. For the better, for worse. Possibly Prevotella. Some species of Prevotella are found in things like infections and abscesses. And they seem to be lower in persons that eat more fat. But again, this is very preliminary. Not enough is known. So when brushing and flossing are seldom required to prevent gum disease and tooth decay, overall health improves. Please keep that in mind. If you're eating something that makes your teeth feel fuzzy, ask yourself what it was. Was it good for you? Metabolic syndrome. So fermentable carbohydrates also promote metabolic syndrome. And you can see that apple shape. Yes, we've gone from our inheritance to this new apple shape. And you can see that this gentleman is actually normal weight. This is called normal weight obesity. He may have some liver involvement as well. It's kind of hard to tell. So the metabolic syndrome is also called prediabetes. So if you hear me say prediabetes or you hear me say metabolic syndrome, I'm talking about the same thing. And it causes high blood pressure. So when people go in to have their blood pressure treated, they really should be examined for metabolic syndrome. No doubt about it. Because about 46% of Americans now who are adults over the age of 20 have either metabolic syndrome, which is also prediabetes, or they have diabetes. 46%. These are the people I strongly recommend, if you're among them, that you get on a low carbohydrate, high fat diet. Okay, the rest of you can probably be a little bit more lenient with your diet. But those of us, and I rank among them, who have these things must be strict too. And that's because by the time you're diagnosed with diabetes, you've already lost some health in your eyes and in your nerves. So it's not like you're fine, and then you have diabetes. It's like diabetes is creeping up on you, and then you get it. Metabolic syndrome is also associated with depressed mood, and in fact there was one study of women where they found that their depression predated their diabetes by about 3 years. It's also associated with cognitive impairment, and in fact there have been some studies that show that high blood sugars themselves impair cognition. So people can't think very clearly, they can't solve problems clearly, and they can also become very irritable. And it's a risk factor for cognitive dysfunction and dementia. So look at carbohydrates. I think of things in terms of drugs, and I would say that the carbohydrate curve looks a little bit like Xanax or crack. Okay, and here I'm talking refined carbohydrates. So you can see that the typical carbohydrates that Americans consume cause very steep blood sugar excursions, but so do proteins. So we can't really ignore protein in the equation. I'm not going to go much into that, but we can't ignore protein. And then fat, notice that the energy is released very smoothly and over a long period of time. So here's what happens to little Johnny in school. He's been given his Fruit Loops and his skim milk. He has nothing really to sustain his blood sugars, no fats, no proteins. And so you see that he's getting on this jag. And by the way, I don't really go by glycemic index because fructose doesn't really show up on there. So just ignore if you see glycemic index or load. I just use these as examples. So you can see that the blood excursion comes up, and then insulin rescues Johnny from a coma by grabbing that excess energy and putting it somewhere, whether it's in a muscle, the liver, or whether in fat. And down he goes. Okay, and that excursion downward leaves him at a lower blood sugar, and both adults and children have this problem. And he can become hungry, irritable, also known as hangry. So now he's hangry, and the teacher says, oh, it's time for your snack anyway. And she gives him like one of the grains that they're supposed to have every day, and maybe some skim milk. And he feels a little better for a while, and then down he goes. And I have adults who come to me with these kinds of problems, and they say, I have bipolar disorder. I am just sure of this. I have bipolar disorder because I have all of these mood swings every day. And if you look up the DSM-5 version of bipolar disorder, that's really not what it says. But they are suffering, and they are struggling. And so my first inclination is to try to change their diet. You can see the one on the right looks much nicer. And a lot of times, if you get a nice low-carb, high-fat breakfast, you may not even be hungry again until 2 or 3 o'clock. You may have to remind yourself to eat. So all stressed out. So with those ups and downs also comes cortisol, because when they get down below into that fight or flight, then they're pumping out all kinds of adrenal hormones, and they don't feel well. And so people worry that their midsections are getting big and that they're highly stressed. I would maintain that it is in large part their diet. So at least 50% of major depressive disorder patients have high levels of cortisol in bodily fluids. And women with depression, especially those that are having a hard time getting rid of their depression, have high levels. So there was also hyperglycemia, which is high blood sugar, and the ability to think or solve problems, which is cognition. 226 men with prediabetes or metabolic syndrome and stable cardiovascular disease. For every 1% higher hemoglobin A1C, and that's how we kind of measure how much sugaring has gone on in the blood vessels and the red blood cells over the past 3 months. For every 1% increase in this, then they had a significantly lower cognitive function, significantly harder time solving problems and thinking clearly. So this is telling me that we're just about done. So we got to unsugar the brain. That's what we need to do. And it's really okay to do that. As previously mentioned in other lectures, the Institute of Medicine says the lower limit of dietary carbohydrate compatible with life is apparently 0. So you can go down pretty low. Although I would tell you that if you make a quick transition to a low carbohydrate diet, you might not feel so well for a few weeks. So just a little caveat there. You might want to follow something like Atkins or any of the other great diet books out there to make that transition. We need fats for our hearts and brains. Heart and brain are electrical. It depends very much on a lipid raft or lipid membrane to be able to carry that electronic signal. The brain is also 60 to 70% lipid, and much of that cholesterol. In fact, the brain actually makes its own cholesterol to make sure that if you don't have it, it has it. But if you have an abundance of it, your brain just may use that. It's very important for us to have that on board. And by the way, omega-3 fatty acids, keep that in mind. Make sure that your omega-3 to omega-6 are in good balance. I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit, but fish oil is a good way to do it for some. All right, so animal fats and cholesterol are important to health. They're a vehicle for fat-soluble vitamins D, A, K, and E, which we're just really starting to understand. Very interesting. Vitamin K2, we didn't know that it helped build bone and also might clear our arteries of calcium. Might just do that. Animal studies look promising. Hormones. You need cholesterol for hormones, stress hormones, sex hormones, inflammation, sugar stabilization. You need that. Harvard's view. Harvard is coming around. They're saying maybe low-fat wasn't such a great idea. And in fact, Walt Willett was one of the researchers in this study of 12,829 adolescents. And basically, in all of these studies, more fat was associated with better weight control. Epilepsy, we're starting to look at what's called a ketogenic diet. That's a diet that has virtually no carbohydrates at all. Ketogenic diet. And some children had up to 100 seizures a day. I mean, this is devastating. They were looking down the barrel of maybe even having half of their brain removed to try to get these seizures under control. And for many of them, the ketogenic diet is what helped. So it can be a miracle for some. We're also starting to talk about Alzheimer's dementia as a type 3 diabetes. And I don't know if you folks have read Mary Newport's story about her husband who had Alzheimer's. Anybody here? Yes? Some of you have? Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. So here's a gentleman with Alzheimer's, and he didn't even qualify for the study that would have given him a drug that may have actually helped. It was a very promising drug. It was called Ketocin at the time. I think it's called Axona now. It's a medical food. And so she looked at this promising drug, since he couldn't get in, and looked to see what it was. And it turned out to be medium-chain triglycerides from coconut oil. So she figured out how much coconut oil to give him every day. Those of you who have loved ones with Alzheimer's, please pay attention, because I think this is a do-no-harm approach. And she gave him basically 2 tablespoons of coconut oil every single day. So we like to do clocks. Psychiatrists, neurologists, we like to do clocks. And you can see the day before his treatment that his clock was very disorganized. That's supposed to be a clock with all of the numbers in place saying 10 to 11. After 14 days, you can see the razor there. He is trying to basically put everything in place. And then at 37 days, much improved. He started actually interacting with family members. He did some gardening. He will never be the practice manager that he was for her in his better days, but his quality of life improved. What was interesting to me is they never did go on to do a ketogenic diet themselves, or go on to do, because I mean, I just looked and saw that they had not quite done that. Who knows what would have happened. So I think these are very promising. So is low cholesterol best for the brain? I would say absolutely not. We know that cholesterol levels below 145 are associated with suspension and expulsion and angry outbursts in children. Very similar in adults as well. Death by violence. So what would happen is they wouldn't die of heart attacks, but they would die of all other causes, suicide and etc. And there are emerging case reports now of persons on statins who are having global amnesia, problems thinking, and if nothing else, even if you thought none of that happened, take into consideration that statins are highly associated with diabetes. So that's going to harm your cognition right there. So ketogenic diet is being used for diabetes type 1 and 2. It's being investigated for both that and metabolic syndrome, obesity, epilepsy, cancer, promising in Alzheimer's, brain injury. It seems like the body does not want to eat. The body goes into immediate ketosis during brain injury, and that can be very protective. Because I think these these refined carbohydrates are just like fire. They're like fire in the brain. They're just too hot to handle. Parkinson's as well, very interesting. And we know that the ketogenic diet is safe if it's well balanced, because there's your diet in the far north. There it is. Right? I would say, however, to eat pastured butter. I think pastured butter is really important because it has vitamins A, vitamin K, vitamin E. It's also got conjugated linoleic acids and a nice balance between omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acid. Turns out that corn lot animals are getting an awful lot of omega-6 fatty acid in the fat, up to maybe 20 times, 13 to 20 times what you would find in the wild. And so these are two arms of the immune system. The omega-3 is non-inflammatory, omega-6 is inflammatory, and we need both. We need both, but they have to be in balance. And that's why I say eat pastured. So you can see in the corn lot, this is from eatwild.org, Joe Robinson. You can see that the animals in the corn lot really lose their omega-3 fatty acids rapidly, practically nothing by the time they go to slaughter. By the way, there's no safe level of trans fat. I believe that trans fat probably lodges in the membranes of our cells. I'm not sure how we get rid of it. No safe level of trans fat, avoid. I think the US at least is trying to do something about this now. And in fact, trans fats may hurt memory. So yeah, gets up there, does it ever get out? I don't know, I was raised on margarine. I'm hoping for the best. So. Replace fermentable carbohydrates with natural fats, cholesterol, and proteins. It's really the bottom line. It's the best thing to do. If you're going to eat fermentable carbohydrates, ferment them, sour them, or do whatever you can to draw down on the sugars in those things. After all, you know, fermentable carbohydrates, you ferment grapes, what do you get? Woohoo! Anyway, so it could be kind of fun, actually. But fats and proteins block hunger. They'll help you stay at a normal weight. They promote absorption of vitamins and minerals. It's just all good. Slowing the release of sugar into the bloodstream, important. And cholesterol is mentioned, basis of steroid hormones. Try to avoid foods that promote gum disease and tooth decay. That's just really important to do. Eat mostly as if you will never brush or floss again, okay? Try it, just try it out. See what your dentist says. Actually, my dental checkups have been amazing, and I probably brush or floss. Oh, I don't know if my dentist is going to see this. Maybe once a week. Okay. So, anyway. So, add gelatin or bone broth. It's really interesting. I was talking to a gentleman who works with cheetahs, and he said they have a lot of neurological problems if they don't get gelatin in their diet. And about 50% of the animal is gelatin. It's in the skin, it's in the cartilage, you know, it's in a lot of the supporting structures. And there's a gentleman, Ray Peat, I don't know if you've ever read some of his stuff, but he says also that it's safer to eat red meat if you're going to eat it with some kind of gelatin. I'm not taking any chances. I take it twice a day. And I put it in my coffee. It really helps the butter mix in. It's great. It's fabulous. Offal is not awful. And actually, if you watch wildlife films, that's really where they go. They leave the rest to the vultures. And I think we could take a lesson from that. A lot of this we're shipping overseas frozen to other cultures that actually eat this. At least in America, that's what we do, because we're very squeamish about these things. But offal isn't awful. In fact, I think somebody did some kind of a look to see if they could compare some tropical fruits to a 1/4 pound of liver. And I think they came up with 8 pounds of tropical fruit for 1/4 pound of liver. And even then, they didn't get everything that was in the liver, because liver is an animal product. So these are very condensed sources of things like choline, which is really sparse in the American diet, especially since we started throwing our egg yolks away. So do try to befriend calf's liver. If you cook liver, by the way, at least in America, we really do have to freeze it for a couple of weeks to make sure there are no parasites, and then go ahead and prepare it the way you like. So is it sustainable? I hope so. I think we've got some really nice models. Alan Savory has used great herds to prevent desertification of land, and Joel Salatin is using a similar system in Virginia, and it's working very well for him. In fact, he's making quite a bit off of his farm, which is great. All right, so I'm going to take just a moment to give you a bonus. News in nutrition politics, who would have believed it? There appears to be a pardon for liver and eggs coming in America. The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee said that cholesterol is not considered a nutrient of concern for overconsumption. Exciting. And guess what? The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics are saying to take not only cholesterol, but saturated fat off the hazards list, and to give a pardon to sodium, saying that our low sodium diet is causing increased mortality, aka death, in healthy populations. And they said go after sugar. So, 3 things. Humans are carnivores. Eating for dental health enhances physical and mental health. Low carb, high fat diet is the bomb for dental and mental health. And I am dating myself. I've been told that before. Thank you.